Confronting an irresponsible person is not painful to him, only consequences are. The law of responsibility, Law 2, includes loving others. Anytime you are not loving others, you are not taking full responsibility for yourself. You have disowned your heart. Problems arise when boundaries of responsibility are confused. We are to love one another, not be one another. I can't grow for you, only you can. Likewise, you can't grow for me. Setting of limits on another's destructive behavior. Give to needs and put limits on sin. The law of power, Law 3. 1. You have the power to agree with the truth about your problems. 2. You have the power to submit your inability to God, humble yourself, confess, believe, and ask for help. You have the power to search and ask God and others to reveal more and more about what is within your boundaries. You have the power to turn from the evil that you find within your repentance. You have the power to humble yourself and ask God and others to help you with your development, injuries, and leftover childhood needs. You have the power to seek those you have injured and make amends. Compliant, non-responsive. Symptoms: compliant, depressed, resentful, unimportant, and non-responsive, guilty or overwhelmed by friends' needs and demands. Roots: compliance feel if they don't control by doing it all, they'll be abandoned. Conflict? Compliant takes on too much. Non-responsive doesn't take enough. Waiting for activities. Ownership? Compliant takes responsibility for making it easy to be walked over. Planning, calling, doing all work, etc. Compliance attempts to control love. Need. Support from other friends. Relationship of unconditional love. Begin. Practical limit setting with supportive friends. Friendship where each carries own weight. Boundaries. Compliance assert responsibility well. Non-responsive reaches out. Next, crisis changes character of friendship permanently. Exposes non-relationship soil for rebuilding together. Being loved leads to commitment and willful decision making. All friendships need to be based on attachment or they have a shaky foundation. The only thing that will keep them calling, spending time with us, and putting up with us is love. That we can't control. Any moment, any person can walk away from a friendship. As we enter more and more into attachment-based life, we learn to trust love. Bonds of a true friendship are not easily broken. In a good relationship, we can set limits that will strengthen, not injure the connection. Romantic relationships are by nature risky. The purpose of dating is to practice and experiment. The end goal of dating is generally to decide, sooner or later, whether or not to marry. Means to find out what kind of person we can complement and with whom we are spiritually and emotionally compatible. Built-in conflict. Freedom to say at any time, this isn't working out, and end. God intended the family to be an incubator in which we grow the maturity, tools, and abilities we need. Once the incubator has done its job, then it's supposed to encourage the young adult to leave its nest and connect to the outside world to establish a spiritual and emotional family system on one's own. We never know if we have forged our own values, beliefs, and convictions, our very identity, or if we are mimicking the ideas of our family. We need to be comforted before we can comfort. This may mean setting boundaries on our ministries so that we can be nurtured by our friends. We must distinguish between the two. A prayerful look will determine whether you need to begin building boundaries with some of your friends. By setting boundaries, you may save important ones from declining. Build and maintain boundaries in intimate human relationships, romance, dating, marriage. Some people were born to take care of their parents. They did not sign up for this duty, they inherited it. Today we call these people codependent. Early in life, they learned they were responsible for their parents, who were stuck in childish patterns of irresponsibility. When they became adults, they had a difficult time setting boundaries between themselves and irresponsible parents. Every time they tried to have separate lives, they felt selfish. First, your parents may not be really in need. They may be irresponsible, demanding, or acting like martyrs. They may need to take responsibility for their own knapsacks. Second, when they are really in need, you may not have clear boundaries to determine what you can give and what you can't give. You may not be able to limit your giving. Example, inability to adjust to old age. Such domination can ruin marriages and hurt children. A family needs to decide what they want to give and what they do not want to give, so they will continue to love and appreciate the parent and not grow resentful. Good boundaries prevent resentment. Giving is good. Make sure, however, that it is the proper amount for your situation and resources. Another frequent dynamic is the grown sibling relationship. An irresponsible adult child depends on a responsible adult sibling to avoid growing up and leaving the family. The irresponsible child continues to play old family games well into adulthood. The tough issue here is the guilt and pressure you feel. Our families can tear us down. Our families can tear down our best built forces. Our families can tear down our best built fences because they are family. One reason is that we did not learn the laws of boundaries in our family of origin, and our adult boundary problems are actually old boundary problems that have been there since childhood. Why in the world do we choose to continue these sorts of patterns? Another reason choosing to continue boundary problems is that we may not have gone through the biblical transition into adulthood and the spiritual adoption into the family of God. The patterns you can learn at home growing up are continued into adulthood with the same players. Lack of consequences for irresponsible behavior, lack of confrontation, lack of limits, taking responsibility for others instead of yourself, giving out of compulsion and resentment, envy, passivity, and secrecy. These patterns are not new, they have just never been confronted and repented of. Your family members are the ones you learn to organize your life around. They are able to send you back to old patterns by their presence. You begin to act automatically out of memory instead of growth. Your family members are the ones you learn to organize your life around. They are able to send you back to old patterns by their presence. You begin to act automatically out of memory instead of growth. Identify the symptom. Identify the conflict. Are you passive and reactive? See yourself as the problem. Identify the need that drives the conflict. Take in and receive good. Humble yourself. Reach out to support systems. Learn to respond to and receive love. Practice boundary skills. Say no to the bad. When you think you are ready to reestablish, bring a friend along. Must have tools. Forgive the aggressor. Revenge keeps you tied forever. Forgive the aggressor or respond. Don't react. You are in control. Love and freedom and responsibility, not guilt. Practice purposeful giving to increase your freedom. Friendship. Mutual drawing together of two people. A non-romantic relationship is attachment-based rather than function-based. Conflict 1. Compliant and compliant. Symptoms. Dissatisfaction. You allowed something you shouldn't have. Roots. Backgrounds where they had to avoid saying no to keep others happy. Who is it? Who? Conflict 1. Compliant and compliant. Symptoms. Dissatisfaction. You allowed something you shouldn't have. Roots. Background where they had to avoid saying no to keep the others happy. Similar roots. Hard to help each other. Boundary conflict. Deny their own boundaries to keep the peace. Who needs to take ownership? Each needs to take responsibility for attempts to appease. Control each other by being nice. Needs. Supportive relationships, support groups, small groups, counselors. Begin. Limits on trivial things about things they like. Next. Admit interest. Different friends for different activities. Not as similar as they thought. No blot on the relationship. Conflict. Compliant and aggressive controller. Compliant feels intimidated and inferior in the relationship. The aggressive controller feels irritated at being pastured by the compliant. Since the compliant is usually unhappy in this relationship, he is the one who needs to take action. Symptoms. Compliant feels controlled and resentful. The aggressive controller feels good except doesn't like to be pestered. Roots. Compliant grew up in a family who taught him to avoid conflict rather than embrace it. Conflict. Inability of compliant to set clear limits. Aggressive controller respects compliance limits. Ownership. Compliant isn't a victim of aggressive controller. Giving his power is his way of controlling. Aggressive controller has difficulty listening to know and accepting limits of others. Needs to take responsibility for their need to control their friend. Conflict. Compliant, aggressive controller, part 2. Needed. Unhappier one, compliant, needs to plug into a support group of people to help him with this boundary conflict. Begin. In preparation, compliant needs to practice setting limits in his group. Aggressive controller could benefit from honest feedback from loving friends on how they run over people, learn to respect the limits of others. How do they set boundaries? Compliant confronts friend on their control. Next time she tries to control him, he will leave. Does not attempt to control her. Confrontation isn't an ultimatum meant to rob her of her choices. Now what? If open, can renegotiate their relationship. New ground rules. Conflict. Compliant, manipulative controller. Symptoms. Compliant resents manipulative controller's requests. Roots. Manipulative controller never faced own responsibility and lack of planning. Compliant avoids conflict with friends. Conflict. Manipulative controller uses compliant to shore up shortcomings. Ownership. Compliance owns limits. Need. Compliant connects to support. Begin. Compliant practices boundaries. Disagree. States opinions. Confronts. Boundaries. Compliant labels own emotions and limits. Manipulative controllers accept their limits and responsibilities. Next. Friendship grows and deepens. Laugh over conflict. The need for revealing your boundaries is important. Passive boundaries, such as withdrawal, triangulation, pouting, affairs, and passive-aggressive behavior are extremely destructive to a relationship. Passive ways of showing people that they do not have control over you never lead to intimacy. They never educate the other on who you really are. They only estrange. Boundaries need to be communicated first verbally and then with actions. Before boundaries, stop yelling at me. You must be nicer. After boundaries, you can continue to yell if you choose to, but I will choose not to be in your presence when you act that way. Before boundaries, you just got to stop drinking. It's ruining our family. Please listen. You're wrecking our lives. After boundaries, you may choose not to deal with your drinking if you want, but I will not continue to expose myself and the children to this chaos. The next time you are drunk, we will go to X for the night, and we will tell them why we are there. Your drinking is your choice. What I will put up with is mine. Boundaries help create mutual balance instead of a split balance. Over-controlled children are subject to dependency, enmeshment conflicts, and difficulty setting and keeping firm boundaries. They also have problems taking risks and being creative. His recovery program will need to be very strong and consistent to help him. Sometimes recovery comes in the form of hospitalization, sometimes in divorce, sometimes in jail, and sometimes in disease. No one can really escape the disciplines of life. They will always win out. We always reap what we sow, and the later in life it is, the sadder the picture it is, for the stakes are higher. Setting limits is traumatic for adult children of alcoholics. Saying no might bring respect or it might bring rage. They are uncertain about what they are and aren't responsible for. Characteristics of family relating. Withdrawal, hostility, and setting inappropriate limits are ways parents act toward their children. Over time, these become ingrained in the soul of the child. Specific traumas can injure boundary development. A trauma is an intensely painful emotional experience rather than a character pattern. Emotional, physical, and sexual abuse are traumatic. A trauma can affect boundary development because it shakes up two necessary foundations to children's growth. The world is reasonably safe, and they have control over their lives. They become frightened that they have no say-so in any danger that approaches them. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted. Isaiah 61:1. God desires the wounds of the traumatized to be bound up, restored, healed by loving people. The law of exposure. Law 10, Part 3. Boundaries exist. They will affect us whether or not we communicate them. We suffer when we do not communicate the reality of our boundaries. If our boundaries are not communicated and exposed directly, they will be communicated indirectly or through manipulation. When our boundaries are in the light, that is, are communicated openly, our personalities begin to integrate for the first time. They become visible and then they become light. They are transformed and changed. Healing always takes place in the light. Withdrawal from our boundaries and hostility toward our boundaries are the ground from which trauma springs. We also contribute to our own boundary development problems by our own depravity. It is our resistance to being creatures under God, our resistance to humility, refusal to accept our position, and a lust for being omnipotent and in charge, not needing anyone and not accountable to anyone. Our depravity enslaves us to the law of sin and death, from which only Christ can save us. Romans 8:2. Law of sowing and reaping. Law 1. It can be interpreted, often is by people who have no boundaries. It can be interpreted, often is by people who have no boundaries. People can interfere with the law of cause and effect by stepping in and rescuing irresponsible people. Rescuing a person from the natural consequences of his behavior enables him to continue in irresponsible behavior. The doer is not suffering the consequences, someone else is. We call a person who continually rescues another person a codependent. In effect, codependent, boundaryless people co-sign the note of life for the irresponsible people in their lives. Then they end up paying the bills, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And the spendthrift continue out of control with no consequences. They continue to be loved, pampered, and treated nicely. The law of exposure. Law 10, Part 4. Real relationship means that I am in the light with my boundaries and other aspects of myself that are difficult to communicate. Our boundaries are affected by sin. They miss the mark and need to be brought into the light of God to heal them and others to benefit from them. This is the path to resolve. Communicate your boundaries openly. Myth 1. If I set boundaries, I'm being selfish. Appropriate boundaries actually increase our ability to care about others. Selfishness and stewardship. Selfishness has to do with the fixation on our own wishes and desires to the exclusion of our responsibility to love others. It helps the children afraid of boundary setting boundaries to know that God meets our needs. Philippians 4:12-13. Philippians 4:19. Our needs are our responsibility. Some individuals see their needs as bad, selfish, and at best a luxury. Others see them as something God or others should do for them. The picture is clear. Our lives are our responsibility. Stewardship. Our lives are a gift from God. Just as the store manager takes good care of a shop for the owner, we are to do the same with our souls. If a lack of boundaries causes us to mismanage the store, the owner has a right to be upset with us. We are to develop our lives, abilities, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. Our spiritual and emotional growth is God's interest on His investment in us. When we say no to people and activities that are hurtful to us, we are protecting God's investment. Myth 2. Boundaries are a sign of disobedience. A lack of boundaries is often a sign of disobedience. People who have shaky limits are often compliant on the outside but rebellious and resentful on the inside. They would like to be able to say no but are afraid, so they cover their fear with a half-hearted yes. Each of us must give as we have made up our minds. When we are afraid to say no, our yes is compromised. Myth 3. If I begin in setting boundaries, I will be hurt by others. We may genuinely believe in boundaries, but we are terrified of their consequences. Is it possible that others will become angry at our boundaries and attack or withdraw from us? Absolutely. God never gave us the power or the right to control how others respond to our no. Some will welcome it, some will hate it. Boundaries are a limit test. Boundaries are a litmus test for the quality of our relationships. First, there's the person who welcomes your boundaries, who accepts them, who listens to them, who says, I'm glad you have a separate opinion. It makes me a better person. This person is called wise or righteous. The second type hates limits, resents your differences, tries to manipulate you into giving up your treasures. Try a litmus test experiment with your significant relationships. Tell them no in some area. You'll either come out with increased intimacy or learn that there was very little to begin with. Bonding first, boundaries second. Remember that you are made for relationship. You need people. You must have places where you are connected, where you are loved unconditionally. It's only from that place of being rooted and grounded in love, Ephesians 3:17, that you can safely begin learning to tell the truth. This is how you can prepare yourself for the resistance of others to setting of your biblical boundaries. Myth 4. If I set boundaries, I will hurt others. If you set boundaries, you fear that your limits will injure someone else, someone you would genuinely like to see happy and fulfilled. Sometimes you see boundaries as an offensive weapon. Boundaries are a defensive tool. Appropriate boundaries don't control, attack, or hurt anyone. They simply prevent your treasures from being taken at the wrong time. We all need more than God and a best friend. We need a group of supportive relationships. Having more than one person in our lives allows our friends to be human, to be busy, to be unavailable at times, to hurt and have problems of their own, to have time alone. Then when one person can't be there for us, there's another phone number to call, another person who may have something to offer, and we aren't enslaved to the scheduled conflicts of one person. Myth 5. Boundaries mean that I am angry. It's no secret that quite often when people begin telling the truth, setting limits, and taking responsibility, an angry cloud follows them around for a while. Friends will make comments like, "You're not the nice, loving person I used to know." The guilt and shame caused by these remarks can further confuse new boundary setters. It's improper use of negative labels. So do boundaries cause anger in us? Absolutely not. The myth is a misunderstanding of emotions in general and anger specifically. Emotions or feelings have a function. They tell us something. They are a signal. Some of the things our negative emotions tell us. Fear tells us to move away from danger, to be careful. Sadness tells us that we've lost something, a relationship, an opportunity, or an idea. Anger is also a signal. Like fear, anger signals danger. However, rather than anger signals danger. However, rather than urging us to withdraw, anger is a sign that we need to move forward to confront the threat. Anger tells us that our boundaries have been violated. Angry feelings serve as an early warning system, telling us we're in danger of being injured or controlled or limited. Anger also provides us with some sense of power. Anger also provides us with a sense of power to solve a problem. It energizes us to protect ourselves, those we love, and our principles. Anger has to be worked through appropriately, otherwise, anger simply lives inside the heart. The protest against the evil and violations of our souls sits inside of us, waiting to tell us their truths. The protest against all the evil and violation of our souls sit inside us, waiting to tell their truths. Individuals with injured boundaries are shocked by the rage they feel inside when they begin setting limits. Generally not new anger, it's old anger. Years of no's that were never voiced, never respected, and never listened to. It's very common for boundary injured people to do some catching up with anger. They may have a season of looking at boundary violations of the past that they never realized existed. Experience the grace of God through others who love you in your anger. This is the first step toward resolving past anger. Second step, rebuild the injured parts of your soul. Take responsibility for healing the treasures that may have been violated. As you develop better boundaries, you have less need for anger. This is because in many cases, anger was the only boundary you had. Once you have your no intact, you no longer need the rage signal. You can see evil coming your way and prevent it from harming you by your boundaries. Don't fear the rage you discover when you first begin your boundary development. It is the protest of earlier parts of your soul. These parts need to be unveiled, understood, and loved by God and people. And they need you to take responsibility for healing them and developing better boundaries. Passive defensiveness or positivity grows into active assertiveness. Self-assured / anger. Label, mirror. Label my own emotion, mirrors and labels. Label, mirror, label my own emotion. Boundaries decrease anger. Individuals with mature boundaries are the least angry people in the world. Those who are just beginning boundary work see their anger increase. This passes as boundaries grow and develop. If you can prevent boundary violation in the first place, you don't need the anger. You are more in control of your life and values. The old saying, don't get mad, just get even, isn't accurate. It's far better to say, don't get mad, set a limit. Myth 6. When others set boundaries, it injures me. First, having inappropriate boundaries set on us can injure us, especially in childhood. Second, we project our own injuries onto others. When we feel pain, one response is to disown the bad feeling and throw it on to others. This is called projection. Third, an inability to receive someone's boundaries may mean there is an overdependent relationship. Quite often, people who have been hurt by inappropriate childhood boundaries will throw their fragility onto others. Sensing their own pain in others, they will avoid setting limits on others, as they imagine how devastating it would be for them. Though we certainly need each other, no one but God is totally indispensable. When a conflict with one significant person can bring us to despair, it is possible that we are too focused and dependent on it. It is possible that we are too focused and dependent on that person to meet our needs. Such dependency is appropriate for children, but they are to grow out of this in adulthood and move into having several healthy and supportive relationships. It tends to slow down our personal and spiritual development. Ask yourself, if the person I can't hear no from were to die tonight, to whom would I go? It's crucial to develop several deep, significant relationships. This allows those in our lives to feel free to say no to us without guilt because we have somewhere else to go. Fourth, an inability to accept others' boundaries can indicate a problem in taking responsibility. Myth 7. Boundaries cause feelings of guilt. One of the major obstacles to setting boundaries with others in our lives is our feelings of obligation. What do we owe not only our parents but anyone who has been loving toward us? what's appropriate and biblical, and what isn't. The idea is that because we have received something, we owe something. The problem is then non-existent debt. The love we receive, or money, or time, or anything that causes us to feel obligated should be accepted as a gift. Gift implies no strings attached. All that's really needed is gratitude. The giver has no expectation that the present will provide a return. It was simply provided because someone loved and wanted to do something for him or her. Period. Why is gratitude so important? Because God knows that our gratitude for what He has done for us will move us to love others. As you were taught and overflowing with thankfulness. Colossians 2:7. We need to distinguish between those who give to get and those who truly give selflessly. If the giver is hurt or angered by a sincere thanks, the gift was probably a loan. If the gratitude is enough, you probably received a legitimate gift with no feeling of guilt attached. The issue of boundaries and gratitude should be kept separate. Myth 8. Boundaries are permanent, and I'm afraid of burning my bridges. It's important to understand that your no is always subject to you. You own your boundaries. They don't own you. If you set limits with someone and she responds maturely and lovingly, you can renegotiate the boundary. In addition, you can change the boundary if you are in a safe place. Ask God to give you a sense of confidence that believes in good boundaries more than you do. A common scenario is this one. One spouse doesn't have a good enough emotional boundaries with the family he grew up in, his family of origin. Then when he has contact with them by phone or in person, he becomes depressed, argumentative, self-critical, perfectionistic, angry, combative, or withdrawn. It is as though he catches something from his family of origin and passes it on to his immediate family. His family of origin has the power to affect his new family in a trickle-down effect. One sure sign of boundary problems is when your relationship with one person has the power to affect your relationship with others. You are giving one person way too much power in your life. Common sign of a lack of boundaries with the family or of origin. The spouse feels like he gets leftovers. He feels as if his mate's real allegiance is to her parents. The spouse hasn't completed the leaving before cleaving process. He has a boundary problem. She has a boundary problem. God designed the process whereby a man shall leave his father and his mother and shall cleave unto his wife. Life. And they shall be one flesh. Genesis 2:24. Many marriages fail because one partner fails to set clear boundaries with the family of origin, and the spouse and children get leftovers. Many adult children perpetually get into financial messes because of irresponsibility, drug or alcohol use, out of control spending, or the modern "I haven't found my niche" syndrome. Adults who do not stand on their own financially are still children. To be an adult, you must live within your means and pay for your own failures. In the perpetual child syndrome, a person may be financially on his own, but he allows his family of origin to perform certain life management functions. Triangulation is the failure to resolve a conflict between two persons and the pulling in of a third to take sides. This is a boundary problem because the third person has no business in the conflict, but is used for comfort and validation by the ones who are afraid to confront each other. This is how conflicts persist. People don't change and enemies are made unnecessarily. This is a clear lack of boundaries because person A is not owning his anger. The person with whom A is angry deserves to hear it straight from him. In addition, person C is being drawn into the conflict, and his knowledge of the conflict gets in the way. Triangulation Part 2. There is a clear lack of boundaries because person A is not owning his anger. The person with whom A is angry deserves to hear it straight from him. In addition, person C is being drawn into the conflict, and his knowledge of the conflict gets in the way of his relationship with person B. Gossip gets between people. It affects our opinions of the people being gossiped about without their having a chance to defend themselves. Triangulation Part 3. Common boundary problems with family of origin. Old patterns of conflict between parent and child, or between two parents, resulting in a family member calling another family member and talking about the third family member. These extremely destructive patterns keep people dysfunctional. Scripture is very serious about dealing with conflict directly with the one you are angry with. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. Matthew 18:15. Triangulation 4. Avoid it. Always talk to the person with whom you have a conflict first. Work it out with her, and only if she denies the problem, talk to someone else to get insight about how to resolve it. Not to gossip and to bleed off anger. Then you both go talk to her together to try and solve the problem. What you can do is influence others. Since you cannot get them to change, you must change yourself so that their destructive patterns no longer work on you. Change your ways of dealing with them. They may be motivated to change if their old ways no longer work. Another dynamic that happens when you let go of others is that you begin to get healthy, and they may notice and envy your health. They may want some of what you have. You need wisdom to know what it is and what it is not. Pray for the wisdom to know the difference between what you have the power to change and what you do not. The law of respect. Law 4. We fear that others will not respect our boundaries. We focus on others and lose clarity about ourselves. Sometimes the problem is that we judge others' boundaries, thinking we know best how they ought to give, and usually that means they ought to give me the way I want them to. And usually that means they ought to give to me the way I want them to. If we condemn others' boundaries, we expect them to condemn ours. This sets up a cycle inside that makes us afraid to set the boundaries that we need to set. As a result, we comply, then we resent, and then love we have given goes sour. The law of respect, Law 4, Part 2. When we accept others' freedoms, we don't get angry, feel guilty, or withdraw our love when they set boundaries with us. When we accept others' freedoms, we feel better about our own. The law of motivation, Law 5. Freedom first, service second. If you serve to get free of your fear, you are doomed to failure. Fear of loss of love or abandonment, fear of others' anger, fear of loneliness, fear of losing the good inside me, made to love, result. When we are not loving, we are in pain. Think love means to always say yes. Guilt. Trying to do enough good things to overcome the guilt inside and feel good about themselves. The law of motivation, Law 5, Part 2. Freedom first, service second. If you serve to get free of your fear, you are doomed to failure. Payback. Many people have received with guilt messages attached. They feel a burden to pay for all they have been given. 7. Approval. Many feel as if they are still children seeking approval. They need to give so that this symbolic parent will be well pleased. 8. Over-identification with the other's loss. People have not dealt with all their own disappointments and losses, so whenever they deprive someone else with the no, they feel the other person's sadness to the nth degree. They can't stand to hurt someone that badly, so they comply. We were called into freedom. This freedom results in gratitude, an overflowing heart and love for others. To give bountifully has great reward. Let God work on the fears, resolve them, and create some healthy boundaries to guard the freedom you are called to.